The snow had a way of swallowing sound out here. You could stand for hours in those woods and hear nothing but your own breath. And maybe, if you listened close enough, the heartbeat of the land itself. It was the winter of 1995 in the far reaches of northern Montana. The kind of cold that didn't just sting your skin. It crept into your bones and stayed there. Pines stood like silent sentinels, branches heavy with snow, while a thin mist curled between the trunks like ghostly fingers. Carl Bennett had lived out here for over a decade. Just a man, a cabin, and the endless wild. Most folks back in town only knew him as that quiet vet who never came in unless it was for supplies. But solitude suited Carl. After Vietnam, noise felt dangerous. Crowds felt louder than gunfire, so he traded city lights for pine shadows. That morning, Carl was chopping firewood. His breath came in thick plumes, his axe steady, methodical. The snow underfoot was fresh, unbroken. That's when he heard it, a sound. Low, long, aching, a howl. Carl froze. Not out of fear, but recognition. Because something in that cry sounded too familiar, like it had once come from inside him. He scanned the trees. Nothing. Just white and stillness. But that howl lingered, like an echo that refused to die. And that's when he knew. Something out there was hurt. And whether he wanted to or not, he was going to find it. Carl wasn't the kind of man who chased after mystery anymore, but something about that wounded howl pulled at a part of him he'd long tried to bury. He grabbed his coat, heavy wool lined with shearling, and slung his old rifle across his back, not out of aggression, but caution. Out here, the woods didn't forgive mistakes. The snow crunched softly under his boots as he stepped off the porch. The tracks were faint, like whispers pressed into the powder. Not deer, not coyote either. Bigger, broader, deliberate, and they wavered just enough to suggest pain. He followed them. About 30 yards past the tree line, he saw it. Slumped against a fallen log, partially hidden by a thicket of frosted brush, lay a gray wolf, its fur tangled and matted with blood. One of its hind legs was twisted unnaturally, and a crude snare still clung to its paw, tight and rusted with age. Its eyes snapped open when it sensed Carl. Golden, alert, but exhausted. Wolves don't beg, Carl thought. But this one, it wasn't begging. It was just done fighting. They stared at each other for a long moment. Neither moved, just two beings measuring the weight of silence between them. Carl slowly knelt, setting the rifle aside. Easy now, he muttered under his breath. Not really to the wolf, maybe more to himself. His fingers reached for the snare, but the wolf let out a low growl. Not threatening, not warning, just afraid. Carl understood that sound better than he cared to admit. It was the same guttural noise he used to make when he woke up in the middle of the night, heart racing, lungs full of smoke that wasn't there. "I've heard that sound in hospital tents," he whispered. "Heard it in my own throat." He took off his gloves, bare hands trembling slightly from the cold, and maybe from something else, and gently began working the trap free. The metal had rusted deep into the animal's fur, drawing blood with every shift. 10 minutes, maybe 15. Time moved strangely when you were close to pain. Finally, with a final twist and snap, the snare gave way. The wolf didn't bolt. It didn't growl. It just laid its head down in the snow, side rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. Carl sat back on his heels. "What now, Bennett?" he asked himself. "Let nature run its course, walk away and forget this happened?" He looked at the wolf again. No, he couldn't. He pulled off his flannel overshirt, gently draped it over the animal, and then, arms under its chest and hind legs, he lifted. The weight surprised him, not because the wolf was heavy, but because of what it meant. "You're really doing this," he thought. "Bringing a wounded predator into your cabin. And for what? Guilt? Redemption? Madness?" He didn't have the answers. But step by slow step he trudged back toward the cabin, the gray wolf silent in his arms, blood marking a trail behind them. And just as the first flakes of a new snowfall began to drift down from the sky, Carl crossed his porch and opened the door. Neither of them knew it yet, but that moment, man carrying beast, was the first step in both their healing. Some battles don't start with bullets. They start with whispers, and sometimes that's worse. It had been 3 days since Carl brought the wolf into his cabin. The first day, it didn't move, just breathed, shallow and rhythmic, stretched out on a folded army blanket near the wood stove. The snare wound had begun to crust over. Carl cleaned it with warm water and iodine, his old field instincts guiding him like a muscle memory. The second day, it opened its eyes and lifted its head. The third day, it tried to stand and collapsed. Carl never spoke much to people. But around the wolf, words started coming back, soft and broken at first. He found himself muttering old war stories under his breath, more to fill the silence than anything else. Not that the wolf cared, it just listened, or seemed to. That was enough. But peace doesn't last long in the woods. It was the morning of the fourth day when Carl heard the rumble of truck tires on snow-crusted gravel. That sound didn't belong out here, not unless someone was coming. He looked out the window. 3 men stepped out of a mud-splattered pickup, all in hunting jackets, thick gloves, wool hats, locals, old friends, or at least men who used to be. "Roy, Carl, you alive in there?" Carl opened the door slowly, stepped out onto the porch, rifle leaning casually against the wall behind him. Not a threat, just custom. "Carl?" "Morning. Thought we'd check in," said Roy, stocky, mustached, the unofficial ringleader of their small-town hunting crew. "Snow's getting thick. Wanted to make sure you hadn't frozen to death out here." "Carl, still breathing." The men chuckled, but the air was tight. Off. Another one, Mark, scanned the tree line. "Mark, we saw tracks coming down from the ridge. Big ones, wolf-sized." Carl didn't flinch. "Roy, you seen anything? Wouldn't be the first time wolves came sniffing around a cabin." Carl looked at them, their faces, familiar but worn by years, by fear masked as bravado. He could see it in their eyes. They weren't just asking, they were probing. People don't like what they don't understand, he thought, and out here they shoot it before they try to. Carl, nope, just deer prints. Might have looked bigger after the snow. Roy frowned slightly, unconvinced. "Roy, that so?" "Carl, that's so." "Dean, well, if you do see one, you know what to do. Ain't no room for predators this close to folks' homes. They take livestock, pets, hell, kids." Carl stayed quiet. He knew this script. They didn't leave right away. Instead, they talked about elk season, the weather, how the town bar had a new owner. But the whole time, their boots shifted in the snow like they were waiting for something. Some crack in Carl's armor. He gave them nothing. "Roy, you take care now, and if you need backup, you know where to find us." Carl watched their taillights disappear into the white. Inside, the wolf hadn't moved, but its eyes were open, watching, like it knew something had shifted. "Carl, we're in it now, they'll be back." That night, he didn't sleep much. The wind howled through the trees like it was mourning something. The wolf stirred once, limped toward the fire, and laid back down. Carl sat in his chair, sipping weak coffee, listening to the silence, and the ghosts that sometimes spoke through it. By morning, the wolf was eating small scraps of venison from his hand. He didn't name it, didn't need to, but the bond between them had grown real, quiet, unspoken but undeniable. The next afternoon, Carl headed to town. Supplies were low. The general store was half empty as usual, but the chatter was full. Man 1, OS. "You hear about the rancher up near Bitter Creek? Lost 2 goats. Found paw prints. Man 2, OS. You ask me, these wolves need thinning out. One shows up near my house. I won't wait on the game warden." "Lena, you've been up there a while. Seen anything strange?" Carl, define strange. "Lena, just be careful, okay? People are jumpy." As he drove home, Carl's jaw tightened. The world was closing in. He could feel it, pressure mounting like snow on a brittle rooftop. Back at the cabin, the wolf was standing, just barely, but standing. And in that moment, Carl knew if they came back, it wouldn't just be to talk. And this time, he'd have to choose. Loyalty to men who once shared his foxhole, or to the creature who shared his silence. Wounds don't always bleed. Some stay buried, aching under the skin, waiting for something or someone to touch the scar. It was just after midnight when the wolf cried out in its sleep. A low, guttural whimper, sharp and broken, the kind that didn't come from pain, but memory. Carl woke instantly. The cabin was dark except for the dying glow of the wood stove. He sat up on the edge of his cot, breath steady. Heart, not so much. That sound, it cracked something inside him. Something old. Something he'd boarded up a long time ago. The wolf stirred again, front paws twitching, breath quickening. Its ears flicked and its muscles spasmed as though it were running, fleeing from something only it could see. Carl didn't speak at first. He just watched. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He talked. "Carl, you're dreaming. I know that place. It's dark, cold, and it never lets go. Mine used to come like that. The smells, the sounds, the screaming, then silence. The kind that sticks to your soul." His hand hovered over the animal, unsure. Then slowly, he laid it on the wolf's shoulder. It didn't pull away. The shaking stopped. Back in Nam, we lost a guy on recon. Thompson, 18, babyface. Stepped on a mine. I saw it happen. Couldn't stop it. Couldn't move fast enough. Spent years blaming myself. Years thinking I should have gone first. When I got back, people thanked me, called me a hero. I'd nod, smile, shake hands. But inside, I was still in that jungle. Still holding pieces of a kid who never came home. There was no answer. None expected. Just the deep, rhythmic hush of a cabin breathing alongside its broken tenants. Carl leaned back against the wall. Snow tapped gently at the window pane. The night was still, but something inside him moved. This isn't about the wolf, he realized. It never was. And for the first time in over 20 years, he meant it.
Montana winters don't break easy, but people break all the time. The days had grown shorter. Snow fell heavier now, blanketing the forest in a deep, relentless white. Each morning, Carl shoveled the path from his porch to the woodshed, checked the traps he no longer set, and tended to the wolf, who now limped slowly but surely around the cabin. The wound had begun to scab and strength was returning to its frame. Its eyes were brighter, more alert, less afraid. But something else had changed too. Carl's radio crackled more frequently. Talk in town had shifted. Reports of missing livestock, fresh paw prints in the snow, hunters gathering for community protection. It was the kind of talk that didn't end in discussion. It ended in bullets. And then, one morning, Carl saw the tire tracks again, fresh, cutting through the snow like a wound. He stepped out onto the porch as the familiar truck came into view. Same as before, Roy, Mark, and Dean. Only this time no one smiled. Roy climbed out first. He didn't wave. "Roy, Carl," he said, "flat, no small talk, we need to talk." "Carl," I figured. Dean leaned against the truck, arms crossed. Mark paced. That was a bad sign. Mark only paced when something was about to go sideways. "Roy, you seen the news?" "Carl, no." "Roy, guy up near Bear Creek lost 4 sheep, all torn up, tracks everywhere, big ones, real big." Carl didn't respond. "Roy, you know what that means, right?" Carl looked at him, silent. "Roy, it means there's a predator nearby," Roy continued. "And folks think it's the same one we tracked near your cabin." "Dean, we know it's here, Carl. We saw the prints, fresh, heading right for your place." Carl's hand moved slightly, resting on the porch rail. Not to reach for a weapon, just to anchor himself, because the words hurt more than he expected. A threat. That's what he'd been called once before, by the world, by his own mind. "Carl, you come here to accuse me of something?" "Roy, we're not accusing. We're trying to protect this town. If you're hiding a wolf, that makes you a threat." "Carl, I'm not hiding anything," Carl said quietly. "Just trying to live in peace." "Mark, peace? You've got a killer under your roof and you call that peace?" The 3 men went quiet. The wind picked up. The trees seemed to lean in. "Dean, we can't risk it. You know how this ends. We put it down before it gets someone." "Carl." "No," Carl said. "Firm now, you won't." "Roy, what are you saying?" "Carl, I'm saying if you go near that animal, you'll have to go through me." A long silence. "Roy, you've changed, Carl. You used to have our back." "Carl, you think I changed?" "I haven't changed. I just stopped pretending I didn't hear the screaming. I stopped ignoring pain just because it came with claws." Mark swore under his breath. Dean looked away. As the truck pulled away, Carl stood motionless, snow falling around him in thick, silent flakes. When he finally turned back inside, the wolf was waiting near the door. It didn't growl, didn't move, just watched. Carl knelt down beside it, eyes level with the animal's. "Carl, but I've faced mine, and I'm not running." Sometimes a man spends his whole life preparing for a fight, and doesn't realize the most important one doesn't come with a rifle, it comes with a choice. The morning came gray and cold. Carl had barely slept. He stood by the window, one hand wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee, eyes scanning the tree line. The snow had fallen heavy overnight, burying tracks, muting everything except instinct, and that instinct told him they were coming. The wolf lay near the stove, eyes open, body still. The leg had healed enough for it to stand, even walk short distances, but not enough to run. Carl had left the front door unlatched, not out of carelessness, but readiness. Carl said, "Let them come." He finished his coffee, pulled on his heavy coat, and checked the old hunting rifle leaning by the door. He didn't load it. He wouldn't need to, not unless they forced his hand. He didn't want a war, but he would not surrender either. And then, he heard it. Engines, tires crunching frozen earth. Not just one truck, 2, maybe 3. He stepped onto the porch, boots crunching on snow as the vehicles came into view, headlights slicing through the morning fog. Roy stepped out first, rifle slung over his shoulder. Mark and Dean followed. This time, they weren't alone. A few other locals Carl recognized by face, not name. They were carrying rifles too, a hunting party. "We know it's here, Carl. One of the ranchers followed the tracks himself. They led straight to your place." "It's not what you think," he said. "It never is," Roy replied. "But this isn't just about you anymore. People are scared." Carl took a step off the porch, into the snow. "Then maybe they need to be braver. You protecting it? A wolf? I'm protecting something that never had a chance. Same way I wish someone had done for me." That hit different, even Roy's posture shifted. "You're choosing a predator over people," Dean said, half in disbelief. "No," Carl said. "I'm choosing mercy over fear. I'm choosing to stand where I once ran. If you won't handle it, we will." Carl raised his hand, not to draw, but to block. "Carl, you fire that gun, you'll be proving everything wrong about this country, that we kill what we don't understand. That strength means power instead of protection, and you'll have to do it with me standing right here." For a moment, just a breath, the world stood still. Fog drifted, snow settled, and nobody moved. Then, a sound cut through the air. A low, powerful howl, from the tree line, and another farther off, then another. The men turned, startled. The wolf at Carl's feet stood, limping toward the door. It wasn't alone anymore. There were more out there, watching, listening. "Carl, you came here for a monster, but all you found was a survivor." Roy muttered again, "This isn't over." But it didn't carry the same weight. Carl replied, "No, it's just beginning." One by one, the others followed Roy back to the trucks. No shots, no blood, just silence. The same kind that used to haunt Carl. Now, it felt different, not empty, just full of meaning. That morning, a man stood between fear and compassion. Not because it was easy, not because he was told to, but because for the first time in his life, he knew what was right. And he chose it anyway. That morning, a man stood between fear and compassion. Not because it was easy, not because he was told to, but because for the first time in his life, he knew what was right. And he chose it anyway. A week had passed since the standoff. The townsmen didn't return. Maybe they didn't need to. Maybe they finally understood. Or maybe they were just waiting for winter to do what they couldn't. But the silence that returned to Carl's cabin wasn't the same one that used to haunt him. This one was full of meaning, of memory, of breath and healing. The wolf, stronger now, walked on all fours without favoring its leg. Each day it ventured a little farther from the cabin, sniffing the wind, testing the snow. It never strayed far, but the distance grew. Carl noticed. He never tried to stop it. Some bonds, he understood, weren't meant to be cages. They were bridges, meant to be crossed once the time was right. One morning, just before dawn, Carl rose early. The fire had gone out in the stove and the air was sharp and biting. He looked toward the corner where the wolf usually rested. It was empty. He stepped outside. Snow was falling again, soft like feathers. At the edge of the clearing, he saw the wolf, standing tall, still, facing the trees. Their eyes met one last time. No words, no growl, no sound, just a knowing. And then the wolf turned and walked, not limping, not afraid, free. Carl stood for a long time, his breath fogging the morning air. He didn't move, didn't call after it, he just watched. And then from somewhere deep in the forest, a howl, clear, strong, alive. Carl smiled, not a wide grin, just a quiet lift of the lips, the kind that says everything you need to say without saying a word. He stepped back inside. The cabin felt different, warmer, not because of the fire, but because something in him had shifted. He sat in his old wooden chair, picked up an old photograph from the mantel, one of him and his unit, younger, harder before time and memory weathered their faces. He set it down again with a soft sigh, then reached for a journal he hadn't touched in years, and he began to write. January 23, 1996. The wolf is gone. But something tells me I'm still here, really here, for the first time in a long time. He paused. And I think I'm gonna be okay. We all carry things, pain, regret, ghosts. But sometimes healing walks into your life on four legs, limping, and reminds you that you're not broken, just mending. If this story touched you, tell me. Have you ever found healing in the unexpected? A person, a place, maybe even an animal? Share your story in the comments. And if Carl's journey moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories that reach the quiet places in our hearts. True courage sometimes means protecting what others fear.